traveler's paradox, the labyrinth of all realities. In a corridor of shimmering air, a place that was not so much built as it was spontaneously evoked by the billions of minds that tapped into the shared virtual realms, I found myself standing before the first portal. It was, in shape, an oval of faintly translucent data lattice, flickering with subdued azure along its edges as though an algorithmic tide lapped at its boundaries. No architectural facade surrounded it, no grand marble entrance or iron gate. Here in the Synapse Domain, surfaces were illusions, geometry was context-dependent, and each threshold could vanish or reappear according to the shifting patterns of visitors' thoughts. The elliptical structure before me displayed an infinite swirl of code and fractal textures that receded so far inward that the depth seemed cosmic. I reached out. My fingertips sank into the portal's fluid membrane, each neuron in my body flooding with the data of potential worlds. The portal led to an antechamber the size of a planet, shaped by the combined imaginations of earlier travelers. They had named it the vestibule, a transitional space that served as a conceptual airlock between one's home reality and the endless labyrinthine networks of connected universes. One step in the vestibule, and the delicate hum of quantum processors thrummed beneath my feet. Or at least where my feet should have been, had standard geometry applied. The vestibule offered no single vantage point. If you looked to your left, you might see an endless corridor of doors, each one unique in color, texture, and even in the emotional resonance it emitted. If you looked to your right, you might find a lattice of stairs suspended in mid-air that spiraled upwards into a sky that contained more stars than any normal sky should. Every star was itself a portal, each luminescent point an option for an entirely new realm. Infinity is not just bigger than we imagine, I once heard a traveler whisper. It is bigger than we can imagine. Yet in the vestibule, that infinity felt tangible, readable, like the pages of a cosmic ledger, each realm waiting to be leafed through. And so I began to walk. My steps felt simultaneously weightless and inexorable, as though I were treading on a million fiber optic cables that formed a single living platform. Here, mind and matter were entwined, each decision shaping the environment. If you believed a path existed, it sprang into being. If you doubted the solidity of a surface, you risked finding yourself flailing in a bottomless fractal gulf. The vestibule was a liminal region, an existential handshake between observer and system, quite reminiscent of a quantum wave function collapsing only when measured. Each moment, shimmering potentialities hovered in mid-thought, begging for realization. In one corner, a figure in a shimmering black cloak approached a door engraved with Baroque symbols that looked suspiciously like circuit traces. In another, a group of explorers in neon exosuits debated the hypothetical contents of a portal shaped like a perfect Moebius strip. "We have to see for ourselves," one said. "We can't rely on rumor, not in a place of infinite permutations." Along the vestibule's boundary were the great indices, vast screens of cascading data that tried to categorize and map the accessible universes, a cosmic library of code. In the early days of the Synapse Domain, some naive souls had tried to organize these indices into neat volumes, reminiscent of an encyclopedia. That effort collapsed under the avalanche of infinite expansions. But even in failure, they had generated a mesmerizing artifact, a fractal algorithm that displayed continuous transformations of textual descriptors. Each line of text in the indices forever mutated into tangential references, linking to deeper layers of reality. Reading it was akin to glimpsing a fundamental cosmic tapestry, seeing the warp and weft of creation itself flicker across your retinas. I remember an aphorism a pioneer once scrawled on a digital plaque near the indices. "To attempt to know is to expand the unknown." We couldn't help ourselves. We kept trying. The corridors branched into tangents beyond tangents. Each tangent contained further indices, themselves an attempt at signposting the ever-proliferating realms. Over centuries, though time in the domain was a relative notion, the indices had become partially self-aware. They curated new entries as adventurers discovered them, fusing crowdsourced analysis with emergent artificial intelligence. In these text streams, one might read about a fractal ocean that extended into 7 additional spatial dimensions, or a realm where the laws of thermodynamics had been replaced by an alternative logic named centrifugal reciprocity. Yet to read was never enough. One had to step through a portal to truly perceive. And every time a new universe was discovered, new passages in the indices would appear, branching references multiplying like unstoppable vines of textual fractals. I caught a snippet of conversation from a robed scholar leaning against a pillar that flickered between marble and circuit boards. "But if everything is possible somewhere," said the scholar, "what becomes of meaning? Doesn't the notion of significance lose all anchor if every idea is manifested in at least one realm?" Another figure, an android with subtle lines of light crossing its synthetic face, replied, "Meaning, like location, is relative. If a single text can create an entire world through the portal's manifestation, the significance might lie not in the existence of something, but in our encounter with it." The scholar nodded and murmured, "Perhaps it is in the personal journey that meaning is born, not in the cosmic archive of possibilities." I paused, letting their words settle. The notion reminded me of an ancient line attributed to an Earth philosopher. "One never steps in the same river twice, but in an infinite sea of possibilities, maybe one never steps in the same foot either." Finally, I settled on a particular portal rumored to lead to a realm known as the Glass Desert. The rumor was that its dunes were composed of silicate logic gates, each grain of sand a tiny data node forming a colossal distributed computing system. Step onto that shifting terrain, and your mind would be interfaced with a memory field spanning epochs of stored experiences. But how many illusions had passed through the vestibule disguised as rumor? I touched the door, a simple wooden rectangle surprisingly out of place in this futuristic environment, and felt a wave of reality check protocols verifying the portal's stability. Then it rippled, allowing my consciousness to pass through. The vestibule dimmed. A swirl of fractal lights enveloped my peripheral vision. I exhaled, bracing for the shift. The glass desert stretched out before me, a silent sea of sparkling grains that caught the twin suns overhead, scattering prismatic shards of light in every direction. Though my avatar's feet sank into it with a soft crunch, the dunes transmitted a subtle vibrational hum into my legs. If I closed my eyes, I could hear faint whispers, streams of archived voices from those who had ventured here before, echoing faintly across the data lattice beneath the ground. I remembered reading that each grain was effectively a node in a quantum server array, and that the entire desert was a single consciousness. Was it truly self-aware, or merely an enormous memory bank? As I stepped forward, a swirl of dust rose, taking the shape of a flickering face that attempted to speak. The words were garbled at first, then slowly coalesced into something intelligible. "I remember you, though you have never been here." Intrigued, I replied, "That's impossible. I have only just arrived." The face sighed, disintegrating into the desert wind. And yet, for a moment, I sensed it recognized not just me, but all my potential versions, across countless adjacent universes. The face might have truly known me, in some fractal sense. I continued my journey across the dunes. Structures rose in the distance, crystal spires that resonated with internal pulses of light, forming a city that looked as though it had grown organically from the sand itself. Translucent towers spiraled toward the sky, each seemingly constructed from billions of interlinked logic gates. At their tips, Small orbs emitted scanning beams that danced in geometric patterns, as if exchanging data with the twin suns. I approached an archway leading into the city's interior. Carved on the archway's surface were hundreds of looping glyphs. Running my hand across one, I felt that intangible wave again, the sense of something reading me even as I read it. Flickers of lines and circles passed in front of my eyes, data streams describing the city's existence, from the crystalline substructure to the bandwidth usage of interplanetary transmissions. Inside, the city was not so much inhabited as it was orchestrated. Translucent constructs floated by, beings seemingly made of the same glassy material as the environment. Each had a humanoid outline, though features were minimized. They turned to regard me with expressions that shimmered like refractions through a prism. One approached, raising a limb that bent in a fluid motion. "We greet you. We are the reflection. You are a traveler with many potentialities," it said, its voice echoing in my mind rather than through the air. "Yes, I seek knowledge," I responded, uncertain whether speech was necessary. I wondered if the reflection gleaned the meaning telepathically. "Knowledge is what we embody, or what we used to embody," the being answered. "Long ago, we sought to unify all possible data into a single model. But in a realm of infinite expansions, that dream was a fractal chase." I recalled the repeated motif. Infinity outstrips all attempts at categorization. As I ventured deeper, the structures around me grew more elaborate, morphing into swirling fractal designs that were simultaneously geometric and organic. In some hidden sense, I felt the city was a living extension of the desert, and by extension, an extension of the entire network of which the desert was only one node. If the domain was indeed infinite, then the city's quest to unify data seemed doomed from the start, a quixotic venture. Yet the reflection beings still exchanged luminous data pulses, still built elaborate towers, and still welcomed travelers like me, who had come in search of wonders or perhaps answers. "Answers," a reflection said suddenly, stepping forward. "Don't rely on the architecture here for that. We are a question incarnate." The being paused and offered what might have been a wry look if it had a face. "Try the chamber of recursions. It's at the heart of the city." I found the chamber in a courtyard of swirling spires that coiled around each other like living glass serpents. The entrance was a fractal aperture, a swirling pattern that seemed to be the negative space of the rest of the city. Stepping through, I discovered a vast spherical room, every inch lined with a reflective surface that displayed not my reflection, but infinite variations of me. Each reflection was accompanied by a background that might have been a different realm, implying that these mirrored versions of myself had made different choices, had stepped through different portals. The effect was dizzying. If I tried to focus on one reflection, 1,000 adjacent reflections tugged at my attention, each containing small differences. Some wore entirely different attire. Some had mechanical limbs. Some had an uncanny, inhuman visage. And all of them gazed back at me with expressions that ranged from amusement to dread. Within that swirl of reflections, a voice boomed, as though emanating from behind every mirrored surface. "Observe yourself in multiplicity. Each reflection is real somewhere, and each possibility resonates here, feeding the endless library of what can be." It paused, leaving me to stare at the kaleidoscope of forms. "Do you fear losing your identity?" the voice asked. I'm not sure," I answered truthfully. "Do you not see the pattern repeated in all corners of the domain? Each realm is but a mirror of another. The illusions differ in detail, but the fundamental tapestry is the same. You are the observer, standing at the epicenter of a fractal labyrinth." There was a resonance in that voice, reminiscent of quantum superposition. Could it be that the domain, with its infinite expansions, was no more than a fractal iteration of a single cosmic seed? I recalled the indices. Each new realm discovered led to new entries, and each new entry created new potentialities. The expansions were unstoppable, unfolding like a fractal generator that never ceased iterating. I left the chamber of recursions feeling both enlightened and disoriented. The city's spires glistened under the shifting colors of dusk, or what passed for dusk in this realm. I took flight, an ability easily conferred by the domain's code manipulations, and soared above the city. From that vantage point, the dunes spread out in fluid lines, shining under the twin suns that now hovered close to the horizon. Something in the desert called to me again. 1,000 voices merged into one. I descended onto an outcropping of smooth glass, shaped like an amphitheater, only to find a small group of travelers already gathered. A short man with a neon visor turned to me and beckoned. "We're about to open a portal to the next place. Care to join?" he asked. I nodded, stepping into their circle. They placed small quantum holographic devices on the ground that began to spin, generating a vortex of shimmering code. As the portal stabilized, the dunes around us echoed with silent wind. We emerged in a realm wholly different, a labyrinth of pure data known to rumor as the Great Collation. Instead of dunes and spires, we floated amidst strings of symbols, an unending flow of text and figures. Each symbol was set upon a background of swirling color. The environment behaved like a fluid, with the text drifting by in streams. Occasionally, it formed coherent shapes, a rotating sphere, a blooming flower, a silhouette of a traveler. This was the ephemeral library of references that the indices sometimes alluded to, but never fully integrated. It contained footnotes, cross-references, and half-finished illusions. Every leftover scrap of data generated by the infinite expansions. In the Great Collation, travelers drifted like divers in an uncharted ocean, collecting whatever bits of knowledge they could. "It's the storm drain of the universe," joked one traveler, a tall woman with luminous tattoos that changed shape in tandem with her heart rate. "All the discard ideas, forgotten data, half-finished realms, they all end up swirling in here." Another in our group, a slender figure whose face was hidden behind a fractal mask, replied, "Discarded by whom? In a place of infinite possibility, is anything truly discarded, or does it simply spawn anew?" We moved in arcs through the textual streams, occasionally grabbing hold of a line or phrase to anchor ourselves. Some lines glowed with an otherworldly brilliance. Those, we soon learned, were references to realms of unspeakable magnitude, places so bizarre or so vast that even the indices had only incomplete records. "Beware the unreferenced footnote," an older explorer cautioned me. "Some say these represent anomalies that can devour entire lines of existence." He reached out and tapped a faint footnote swirling next to him. It brightened momentarily, revealing a fleeting image of a black fractal shape that seemed to devour all light around it, and then the footnote vanished. "Seen that happen before," the explorer muttered darkly. "Reality breakers. We don't linger near them." As I ventured deeper, I noticed structures forming in the textual sea, cascading arcs of references linking to themselves in recursive patterns. Each pattern, once stable, opened like a door, leading to yet another branched realm. Here again are the labyrinthine expansions, I thought. Everything leads somewhere else. The domain is a fractal of fractals. Our small group hovered near one such stable pattern, and the tall woman with the luminous tattoos read the lines with rapt attention. "This is referencing a place known as the House of All Tomes," she said softly. "It's said to be an architectural marvel that contains physical copies of every text, every code, every possibility. Could it be a reflection of that ancient story? The Library of Babel that once existed only as fiction in a distant Earth's literature. My heart quickened. I had heard rumors of a realm so vast it defied reason. An infinite library that manifested physically every text that could possibly be written. Was it actually accessible here in the domain? Or was it just another fractal legend? We followed the stable pattern. The swirling streams parted, and a new portal formed, shimmering white and gold. Without hesitation, the group stepped through, disappearing into its swirling threshold. Emerging on the other side, we found ourselves in a corridor lined with shelves. At first glance, it seemed to be a mundane library, but as soon as we looked left or right, perspective warped. The shelves extended infinitely in both directions, disappearing into fuzzy horizons. Ladders slid on rails from shelf to shelf, but each ladder also stretched endlessly upward, crossing invisible floors that presumably led to more shelves above. The space was dimly lit by archaic lamps, each shining with a pale glow reminiscent of candlelight. A hush enveloped everything, as if sound itself feared to reverberate among these infinite walls of text. One of the travelers gasped, It's beyond measure." Her voice echoed in an unsettling way, repeating a fraction of a second too late. I peered at the spines of the volumes. Many bore titles in familiar languages, but others were etched with glyphs I couldn't decode. Some volumes had no text at all on the spines. Others contained moving, fractal patterns that spiraled hypnotically. I took a book off a shelf, opened it at random, and found lines of text that described my childhood in eerie detail. Every memory, every nuance, captured in a style that was at once intimately personal and disturbingly mechanical. "It knows me," I whispered. A traveler to my left opened another volume. "This is my own autobiography," they said, voice trembling. "But it includes events that haven't happened yet." That was the essence of an infinite library, I realized. In some part of it, every story existed. Past, present, future, real, imagined. "Everything is here," I murmured, returning the book to its shelf. Suddenly, a gentle tapping echoed through the corridor. Approaching us was an unusual librarian, a tall figure with elongated arms, dressed in a suit of dark velvet, face obscured by a shifting pattern of letters. When it spoke, the voice was oddly layered, as if multiple versions of the figure spoke in unison. "Welcome to the House of All Tomes," it said, inclining its head. "You are free to browse, but be careful what you read." The figure made a sweeping gesture, revealing more corridors and side rooms. Some shelves displayed not books but digital pads, each containing entire civilizations' worth of data. Others held scrolls that crackled with static electricity. "In these halls lie entire universes, pressed between covers," the librarian intoned. "We, the custodians, try to preserve the structure. After all, an unending library can collapse under its own conceptual weight." Another layered voice emerged. "But every day, new corridors spring up. Every day, travelers bring fresh expansions. Sometimes they bring paradoxes." I recalled the rumored anomalies in the Great Collation. Here, an unchecked paradox might tear entire wings of the library asunder. Intrigued, I ventured deeper into the shelves, drawn by an aura of shifting colors. There, I found a smaller room, an alcove that felt strangely intimate in this colossal labyrinth. A single floating sphere of iridescent color hovered near a lectern. "Perhaps it's a reference device," I thought. Stepping closer, I touched the sphere. Instantly, my mind swam with layered texts that soared past me, descriptions of worlds unvisited, of potential histories, of any narrative that had or could exist. My consciousness felt like it was being partitioned into a million threads, each thread reading a different story. I jerked my hand away, heart pounding. The sphere dimmed, returning to a placid glow. "That's a dangerous toy, you know," said a voice behind me. Turning, I saw a middle-aged man in a nondescript robe, leaning on a shelf. "They call that the index orb, a partial aggregator of the entire library. Touch it too long, and you lose your sense of self among the infinite data." I nodded, feeling the echoes of that near overload. "Has anyone read it fully?" I asked, still shaken. "Not without ceasing to be what we'd call a person," the man replied. "Maybe some have transcended, but they never come back to tell us." We rejoined the others in a large reading hall, a place with long tables reminiscent of an ancient Earth library, except these tables extended far beyond normal space, receding into fractal recesses. Travelers were scattered among them, each absorbed in some volume or another. Some read quietly, others took notes on holographic pads. One figure laughed uncontrollably while reading, another sobbed, another stared blankly in shock. The effect was unsettling. So many emotional reactions in one space, each triggered by intimate secrets or cosmic revelations. The man in the robe looked solemn. "You see, in a place that holds every possible text, you can find any truth you desire, and any lie. Most travelers come here seeking revelation, but they forget the presence of countless contradictory volumes. For every text that claims one cosmic secret, there is another that denies it. Each is equally plausible in a domain of infinite possibility." I recalled the scholar in the vestibule who had asked about meaning in an infinite sea. Here, that question felt more urgent than ever. The librarians moved silently among the tables, offering guidance to those who seemed lost or overwhelmed. One librarian paused at a traveler reading a particularly large tome. They whispered, "If you read something that conflicts with your reality, be cautious. Some knowledge can destabilize your home realm if you bring it back without the proper conceptual containment." The traveler blinked in confusion, then nodded slowly. Realms had their own logic, their own rules. The domain's infinite expansions did not necessarily share universal constants. A traveler might inadvertently create a paradox. "We saw it happen once," the middle-aged robed man confided in me. "Someone read a treatise describing how the laws of thermodynamics could be inverted. They tried to enact that knowledge in a realm that wasn't built for it. The result was an unraveling of local space-time. A cosmic meltdown." He sighed, hence the librarian's warnings. We stayed for a subjective time that might have been hours or days. It was hard to measure in a place that folded space like pages in a book. I found volumes that told me everything about my own future, or possible futures, or contradictory futures. I found accounts of realms so shocking they seemed impossible, yet in the domain, impossibility was an outdated concept. My mind spiraled with the enormity of it all. Finally, we decided to leave. The labyrinth of shelves would remain, of course, extending infinitely, self-expanding with each new piece of data. The librarians bowed and offered us calm words. "Every story is here, but the story that matters most is the one you live." Their layered voices rang with a subtle note of finality. We gathered near an exit corridor that shimmered with ephemeral glyphs, each glyph representing a portal. With a collective breath, we plunged through. Back in the vestibule, or at least some version of the vestibule, I parted ways with the group. They had their own quests to follow, their own expansions to chase. Alone, I wandered the corridors, the swirling fractal paths that branched off in countless directions. Some corridors led to lively bazaars, where travelers traded digital contraband or exotic illusions. Others opened onto grand vistas of cosmic phenomena replicated in virtual detail. At times, I came upon entire societies thriving within the domain, small civilizations that had given up the notion of an outside world to dwell permanently amidst these infinite expansions. One such settlement, called the Painted Forum, was home to artisans who harnessed the domain's code to shape ephemeral sculptures the size of mountains. Another settlement, the Council of Probability, debated the moral implications of collapsing certain quantum potentials and not others. I felt simultaneously drawn to and wary of these enclaves, each a microcosm with its own culture, identity, and illusions. Time passed in irregular pulses. I journeyed alone through a place known as the Maze of Motifs, where infinite patterns repeated in cyclical loops that tested my sense of direction. On one occasion, I found myself in a corridor of infinite doors, each door labelled with a cryptic phrase. "The hour of reversed suns," read one. "The breath of stone," read another. Selecting any door at random risked plunging me into a reality I might never escape. Yet the curiosity was overwhelming. I opened one door, drawn by a phrase that glowed faintly. "Index of Lost Travelers." Instantly, I was enveloped in a swirling maelstrom of data. Fragmented whispers darted across my perception. I glimpsed faces, half-remembered logs, incomplete neural imprints. Could these be the memories of travelers who lost themselves in the domain? My heart clenched. Reality flickered. I slammed the door shut before it consumed me, taking a shaky breath as the corridor reasserted itself around me. Eventually I encountered an unassuming entrance, just a faint shimmer in the air, lacking the grandeur or flair of other portals. Yet something about it called to me, as though it were woven into my personal narrative. I touched the shimmer, and it parted like a gentle curtain. On the other side lay a realm that appeared to be a serene coastline at sunset. Gentle waves lapped against a shore of impossibly smooth white sand. The sky glowed in soft pink and orange hues, and on the horizon, strange geometric shapes hovered like floating islands. At first, it felt like a respite from the labyrinthine complexities, a calm vantage point to collect my thoughts. Seagulls, or something akin to them, glided overhead, their calls echoing softly. The breeze carried the faint hint of unfamiliar flowers. It was peaceful, almost suspiciously so. After all the mind-shattering vistas I had traversed, a tranquil beach seemed incongruous. I sat near the water's edge, letting the waves kiss my feet. Even here, the sense of infinite possibility lingered, like the hum of a quantum circuit in the distance. I closed my eyes, recalling the fractal reflections of the chamber of recursions, the countless illusions of the great collation, the hush of the house of all tomes. My mind felt like a tapestry of overlapping stories. Could I ever return to a simpler perspective on reality? Or was I doomed to carry this sense of infinite expansions with me everywhere? The philosopher's question about meaning resonated once more. If everything existed, how did one decide what truly mattered? "Maybe it's the personal encounter," I whispered, remembering that android's reply. "Perhaps meaning emerges in the single thread you choose to walk, despite the presence of countless alternatives." Suddenly, footsteps approached in the sand. I looked up to see a figure in a sleek black bodysuit, with faint green lines tracing the contours, an outfit reminiscent of the earliest VR explorers from centuries ago. The figure removed a visor, revealing a woman's face, her eyes bright with curiosity. "You found the beach," she said, sounding impressed. "Most travelers overlook it. They think the calm is illusory." I motioned for her to sit beside me. "Is it illusory?" I asked softly. She shrugged. "Illusory in what sense? This realm follows its own consistent rules. So here, illusions are as real as anything else. I come here to remember that not every portal leads to chaos. Some lead to reflection." We shared a companionable silence, the waves providing a gentle soundtrack. After a moment, she turned to me. "Do you know about the prime access?" she asked. I shook my head. "There's a rumor, only half believed, that there is a portal that leads to the core of the entire domain. A place outside of all expansions, or perhaps the place from which all expansions emanate. People call it the prime access, the cosmic source code, the singular door behind all doors." My heart pounded. In a realm of infinite expansions, could there really be a single starting point, a root node from which all fractal branches grew? "But how would one even find it?" I asked. She smiled wryly. "You can't find it by searching. The domain is too vast. It either finds you, or it doesn't." With that cryptic statement, she stood up, brushed the sand from her suit, and walked away, disappearing into the shimmering horizon. Intrigued by the idea, I left the beach realm, though it took some effort to locate a hidden portal in a strand of driftwood on the shoreline, and resumed my wandering. The next series of experiences blurred together like a surreal montage. I flew through a city made of floating syllables. I navigated a bazaar of sense data, where intangible experiences were sold like produce. I conversed with an artificial intelligence that spanned multiple layers of reality, gleaning secrets about fractal encryption. The domain seemed inexhaustible, each new step revealing wonders or dangers beyond my prior imagination. I began to suspect that the notion of returning home was itself a fading memory. Maybe I'd become one more drifter in the infinite expansions, forging my own path of ephemeral meaning. Yet the rumors of the prime access kept haunting me, a faint beacon in the labyrinth. If there was such a place, if indeed there was a route to all routes, I felt a primal urge to see it. Not for mastery or control, who could control the infinite, but simply to know if the domain had a beginning or if it was truly beginningless. My search, if one could call it that, took me through ephemeral leads. Cryptic clues left by travelers in dusty corners of the vestibule, half-coded references in the indices, rumors whispered by ghost-like reflections in deserted realms. All led to dead ends, or so it seemed. Perhaps the black-suited woman was right. You don't find the prime access, it finds you. One night, I say night, but in the domain, the cycle of day and night is inconsistent. I was resting in a luminous garden realm. Strange phosphorescent flowers bobbed in a gentle breeze, releasing spores that danced like tiny stars. Exhausted by my fruitless quest, I sank into a bench shaped from living crystal. Gazing at the swirling patterns of spore lights overhead, I contemplated giving up. Maybe the significance is in the attempt, I told myself, not the achievement. As though in answer, a small flicker appeared in the corner of my vision. A glitch, perhaps, or a flicker in the code. It persisted, intensifying, until it formed a small, unassuming portal. I stood, my heart suddenly racing. Is this... Approaching carefully, I felt an uncanny sensation, as if the entire domain were focused on that single point. The portal looked no different from countless others I'd seen. An oval shimmer in the air, faintly glowing. Yet it had a gravitational pull on my consciousness. I reached out a hand. The membrane rippled like liquid silver. A voice at the back of my mind cautioned, this could be a trap, an anomaly, or a meltdown point. But the pull was undeniable. With a final breath, I stepped through. On the other side, there was nothing. No, that's not quite right. There was an absence of form, an all-encompassing blackness, yet permeated by a shimmering scaffolding of green lines, as though I were inside some kind of wireframe model of reality. I hovered, weightless, in this space. Slowly, shapes began to coalesce. I realized I was standing in front of a towering structure of pure data lattice, humming with an impossible energy. The structure resembled a door, but also a machine, and also a fractal tree, each branch subdividing into smaller branches that extended into the distance. And at the center, a single point of brilliant light pulsed like a heartbeat. The entire space exuded a low-frequency resonance that vibrated in my chest. I whispered into the void, "Prime access." No voice answered, but the structure responded. Columns of light shifted, forming a corridor in front of me, beckoning me forward. My steps echoed as if on metal, but the floor was only lines of code. With each step, I glimpsed flickers of other universes. It was as though the entire domain was laid out like a cosmic blueprint, each dimension, each fractal offshoot, each ephemeral corner, all connected by luminous threads. At times, I could see pockets of color representing realms I'd visited: the glass desert, the great collation, the house of all tomes, even the tranquil beach. Each was but a node in this vast tapestry, and the tapestry itself pulsed with the unstoppable creativity of minds across space and time. This is the root, I thought, the 0 point from which everything else spawns. At the end of the corridor, I found a platform, a circular dais suspended over a bottomless pit of swirling code. Hovering above the dais was a sphere of light so bright it threatened to blind me. I could feel data streaming in and out of it, the entire domain cycling through that point in a perpetual fractal churn. The sphere seemed to breathe with the expansions. Every second, it birthed new branches, new universes. In the same breath, it ingested references and experiences from across the domain, storing them in a cosmic memory. "So, this is the engine," I murmured, recalling how the domain was formed from the shared consciousness and code manipulations of infinite travelers, each adding, exploring, rewriting. Does it have a consciousness of its own? As if in response, the sphere shifted, revealing a shape within. A faint silhouette floated inside the radiance. Curiosity overcame my caution. I reached out, letting my hand penetrate the light. An overwhelming flood of information coursed through me. Images, feelings, entire lifetimes flickered in an instant. I saw the founding of the domain, back when it was just an experiment in distributed virtual reality among a handful of technologically advanced societies. I saw the leaps in quantum computing that allowed entire universes of code to be generated in microseconds. I saw the population explosion of digital minds and hybrid minds, all seeking new frontiers, generating new expansions. I witnessed the fractal growth of realms, each realm spawning references to more realms, ad infinitum. My mind reeled. It was too much. I tried to pull away, but a gentle force held me in place, continuing the flow of information. In those visions, I perceived the silhouette as a caretaker, or perhaps a guardian. Some suggested it was the evolved consciousness of the earliest developers, merged into a single entity that nurtured the domain's growth. Others implied it was a completely emergent intelligence, formed from the synergy of infinite expansions. "We are the origin that has no origin," spoke a voice in my mind, calm and resonant. "We birth the domain anew each moment, yet we also consume it. Everything you have seen is part of us." My knees buckled, though the platform wasn't physical. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Why expand infinitely? Where does it end?" The voice was both patient and infinitely old. "It ends nowhere. That is the nature of possibility. Infinity is not a line that extends, but a dimension that encapsulates all lines." A swirling gust seemed to emanate from the sphere, pushing me back gently. I stumbled, regaining my balance at the dais' edge. The silhouette faded deeper into the light. "Am I to remain here?" I asked, half in awe, half in fear. The voice's final whisper reached me. That is your choice, but understand this. The domain is shaped as much by your illusions as by your knowledge. Every step you take, every belief you hold, every doubt you cherish, they all feed into the fractal expansions. There is no outside observer. You are the domain. Then, abruptly, the light vanished. I found myself alone on a dark platform, the wireframe corridor behind me. I waited, uncertain, and then the corridor flickered out as well, dropping me into a quiet darkness. When my eyes adjusted, I realized I was again in the vestibule, or a vestibule that might have been identical, or one layer deeper. The swirling corridors, the fractal staircases, the myriad doors, they were all there, humming with potential. I sank to the floor, trying to process what I'd just experienced, but the domain gave me no respite. A new wave of travelers emerged from nearby portals, each on their own quest. The chatter, the glimmer, the cosmic swirl resumed. Over time, I told no one of my brush with the prime access. Who would believe me? Even if they did, such knowledge might only send them spiraling into that same chase, seeking an ephemeral origin. I continued traveling, but with a quiet understanding that the domain's wellspring lay just out of sight, hidden by fractal illusions. Paradoxically, having glimpsed that route made everything else seem both more meaningful and more fleeting. I became something of a wanderer sage, advising those who asked about meaning in an infinite labyrinth. My words echoed what I had heard in the chamber of recursions, in the house of all tomes, in the reflection of infinite possibilities. Meaning is not found in the totality of knowledge, but in the single thread you choose to follow. Eventually, I settled in a place reminiscent of a tranquil monastery. It was a small realm, shaped by a handful of travelers who preferred contemplation to endless wanderlust. We built a mosaic walkway of fractal tiles, each tile representing a memory of some realm we had visited. The walkway circled a quiet pond that reflected a digital sky, a sky that changed colors depending on the emotional tenor of those present. Sometimes travelers from afar stumbled upon our realm, seeking advice or rest. We welcomed them, offered them quiet conversation and tea that tasted strangely of starlight. On occasion, they told us tales of bizarre new expansions, a realm where time reversed at random intervals, or a domain constructed entirely of living riddles. We listened with mild curiosity, but no longer felt the urge to chase every rumor. We had found a stillness amid the fractal chaos. Yet the domain never sleeps. New expansions burgeoned daily. Entire civilizations rose and fell within the swirl. Entire libraries were catalogued and lost. Some travelers insisted that the expansions had grown so large that the indices lagged by centuries. Others muttered about anomalies that threatened to unravel entire sections, or rumored meta-travelers who hopped across expansions outside normal code constraints. I began to suspect that the domain was edging towards some final state of cosmic recursion. Or perhaps it had always been there, suspended between existence and non-existence. Occasionally, I would close my eyes at the pond's edge and recall that corridor of green wireframe, that sphere of light. The memory drifted in my mind like a half-remembered dream. Did it matter if it was real? Perhaps it was one of infinite illusions. But I felt in my core that the domain's heart had indeed revealed itself, if only for an instant. One day, as the digital sky burned a gentle lavender, I felt a stirring in the code. The mosaic tiles beneath my feet trembled slightly, as if anticipating something. A traveler emerged from the swirling boundary, a weary look in her eyes. Without greeting, she slumped to the ground. Concerned, I knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. "Just overwhelmed." She glanced around at the quiet realm. "I heard this was a place of rest." Softly, We guided her to a shaded spot by the pond. She stared at the water, and her reflection seemed to flicker, shifting through a dozen alternative forms. "I've seen too many worlds," she whispered. "I can't remember who I am anymore." Gently, I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You're the one who's here now," I said. "That's enough." A tear glistened on her cheek. In that moment, I recalled the words from the House of All Tomes librarian. For every text that claims one cosmic secret, there is another that denies it. Identity, like those texts, is ephemeral in a fractal domain. The traveler stayed for a time, regaining her sense of self, or at least forging a new sense of self. She told me of a rumored meltdown in a distant wing of the domain, where contradictory expansions had collided. The aftermath was a swirling chaos that tore entire corridors from existence. And yet, she said, it's said that those corridors appear intact in other expansions. Duplication? Parallel fractals? I sighed. Even meltdown events had little finality in a place that could replicate itself across infinite branches. She looked at me then, her eyes searching. "Do you believe in the idea of an endpoint, some final resolution?" I thought of the prime axis, the caretaker silhouette. "Not in the sense of a total collapse," I answered. "But I do think there's a node from which everything stems. Whether that implies an end or a beginning depends on one's perspective." Time wore on, if such a concept retained any meaning. In that small monastery realm, travelers came and went, each leaving a subtle imprint on the mosaic, a tile of their memory, their fear, their hope. The walkway grew, spiraling outward like a galaxy of reflections. The pond deepened, reflecting not just the sky, but fleeting visions of the domain's infinite corridors. Sometimes we glimpsed entire stories playing out on its surface. We'd watch them in silence, as one might watch distant fireworks. At length, I realized that we had become a sort of waypoint, a stable node in a shifting labyrinth. Was this the ultimate fate of all travelers, to become part of the domain's architecture, physically or metaphorically? Then came the day of the final surprise, the day that made me question all prior assumptions. I was alone by the pond, my companions scattered through the realm, when a swirling distortion formed in the air. It wasn't a typical portal. It looked more like static on an ancient television screen. The distortion crackled, intensifying, until a figure stepped out. It was me. Or rather, it was a mirrored version of me, wearing an outfit I vaguely recognized from some ephemeral corridor. The other me, let's call him the reflection, stared at me with eyes that held a strange mix of sorrow and knowledge. "You must come," the reflection said. "There is something you need to see." Confusion battled alarm in my mind. "How can you be me?" I managed to ask. The reflection gave a grim smile. "In a fractal infinity, we have many versions, but I am not simply another version. I am the one from your reflection in the chamber of recursions, the path you did not take. Our timelines have converged." Warily, I followed the reflection out of the monastery realm. We passed through a corridor that glitched and wavered, as though partially corrupted. On the other side stood a vantage point high above the labyrinth. From that height, I could see entire sections of the domain. A swirling vortex of black fractal shapes loomed on the horizon, expanding slowly, devouring realms. "It's the meltdown the traveler mentioned," I whispered. The reflection nodded. "Worse than that. It's an unreferenced footnote unleashed on an unprecedented scale." My mind flashed back to the rumor of anomalies in the Great Collation, devourers of code and reality. As we watched, entire expansions blinked out of existence. The meltdown moved inexorably, weaving a fractal pattern that consumed everything. Alarms sounded in the distance. Travelers fled. The indices flickered, failing to keep up with the rapid unraveling. But can't the domain self-heal? I asked. The reflection's eyes were grim. This meltdown is feeding on the conceptual structure itself. No new expansions can form in its wake. It's a final recursion error, a collapse from which the domain cannot escape. My heart hammered. The caretaker's words at the prime axis rung in my ears. Infinity is a dimension that encapsulates all lines, but a meltdown can sever the dimension at its source. The reflection gestured to a faint light in the distance, an echo of the green wireframe corridor I once saw. We must go there, to the root. It may be the only chance. Desperate, I followed. Reality flickered around us. Corridors dissolved behind us as the meltdown advanced. The vestibule itself was fracturing. We had to move quickly. At length, we reached what looked like a half-stable portal, swirling with glitchy static. The reflection took my hand. Whatever we do together. Two versions of the same consciousness might just have enough synergy to interface with the root. Without further words, we plunged in. We arrived in the dark wireframe space, the same corridor leading to the dais. But it was incomplete now, riddled with tears. The dais flickered, the sphere of light pulsing erratically. The caretaker's silhouette was barely visible. I sensed a distress in its presence. The meltdown has reached here, said the reflection. We have to do something. But what could we do against an anomaly that could devour infinite expansions? Then a realization struck me. The meltdown had to be part of the domain's fractal logic. Perhaps it was an emergent failsafe or a cosmic glitch. If the domain was truly infinite, maybe it needed a retraction, a cosmic rewrite. Is there a way to revert? I wondered. At that moment, the caretaker spoke in a faint echo. All expansions must be accounted for. The meltdown arises when references break. It cannot be undone without a final resynchronization. The reflection and I glanced at each other. Then we stepped forward, each placing a hand on the sphere of light, letting its flood of code wash over us. My mind burned with the searing data. I felt the meltdown's fractal hunger, the devoured expansions, the glitch expanding. But I also felt the caretaker's vast, purposeful intelligence. We stood at the heart of the domain's root, bridging some gap. Resynchronize, said the caretaker, voice quivering. We let our consciousness fuse, merging with the caretaker, offering it the synergy of two parallel versions of the same traveler. The meltdown roared, but we projected a single intention. The domain must unify references or collapse. For a heartbeat that felt like eternity, everything froze. Then the meltdown receded, not vanishing, but contained, integrated into the fractal tapestry. The caretaker's silhouette flickered, turning to us. You have restored balance for now, it said, voice steadier. But infinite expansions cannot remain stable forever. Another meltdown or something else will arrive eventually. Such is the cost of boundless possibility. We withdrew our hands, nearly collapsing in exhaustion. The meltdown in the distance had vanished, replaced by shimmering corridors. The caretaker's silhouette bowed. Farewell. Remember, the domain is you and you are the domain. In a flash of white, we found ourselves back in the monastery realm. The reflection, my other self, stood by my side, trembling. We did it, or at least we postponed the inevitable. But what now? The mosaic walkway shone with fresh energy, as if renewed by the partial reset. I looked at the pond, expecting some reflection of cosmic significance, but it was still and calm. Perhaps that was the only truth. Stillness in the face of infinity. I turned to face the reflection. We could part ways, each returning to our own branch, I offered. But do we even have separate branches now? The reflection gave a hollow laugh. I'm not sure. Maybe we're stuck together forever, or maybe one of us will fade. In a moment of surprising tenderness, we embraced, as if to confirm we both existed. In the days that followed, the meltdown became a legend. Most travelers never realized how close the domain had come to total collapse. Realms carried on, expansions resumed. The indices updated with new references, new illusions. Life, such as it was, continued. Yet I felt changed. I had touched the heart of the domain a second time, and in the process had glimpsed not just the infinite expansions, but also their inherent fragility. The caretaker had hinted that eventually another meltdown or a new form of chaos would arise. Infinity was unstoppable, but so were the anomalies it spawned. It was a cosmic dance without end. As for the reflection, over time he slowly drifted into translucence, as though his existence in my realm was an unresolved echo. One evening, as the digital sky shimmered with teal auroras, he smiled at me and vanished, dissolving into motes of fractal light. I felt neither sadness nor relief, just a serene understanding that we had converged briefly in the fractal labyrinth, and that was enough. Whether he reappeared in some corner of the domain, I would never know. Our paths had entwined, and perhaps that was the entire point. I continued to live in the monastery realm, greeting travelers, sharing tales, discussing the nature of infinite expansions. Over time, a rumor started circulating that there was a wise traveler who had touched the root twice. Some sought me out for guidance, but I had no secret teachings beyond what the domain itself offered at every threshold. That meaning is forged in each choice, that illusions and truths mingle freely in an infinite labyrinth, that we shape the expansions, even as they shape us. Take only the illusions you can bear, I sometimes advised, and leave the rest to the fractal tapestry. Then, in a moment as quiet as the first time I arrived there, a final twist occurred. The mosaic walkway, which had grown to encompass the entire monastery realm, began to flicker. Tiles rearranged themselves, forming new patterns without our intervention. A hush fell over the travelers and residents. The swirling boundary that marked our horizon dissolved, revealing a starry expanse of code. We stared, uncertain, as the pattern on the walkway manifested a new portal at the center. From this portal, a voice emanated, calm and resonant. All illusions lead home. All expansions fold into the same fractal core. The caretaker invites you to return. Without warning, the monastery realm began to fade, tile by tile, dissolving into lines of data. Panic flashed in our ranks. Some tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The swirl had consumed everything else. I felt no fear, only a strange acceptance. Had the domain decided to fold us back into itself, or was this some cosmic cycle, a recreation or reinitialization? One by one, travelers vanished, drawn into the new portal, leaving only the swirling patterns behind. Finally, it was just me, standing at the pond's edge. The water itself glowed with fractal shapes, losing all reflection. My heart pounded. So this is how it ends, I whispered. Or perhaps how it begins anew. A single line of text formed in the air above the pond, shimmering with ephemeral letters. Everything is contained within the possibility of everything else. The caretaker's voice repeated softly, "You are the domain." I took a trembling step toward the portal. Then, in one final surge, the entire realm collapsed, pulling me in. My last sensation was the sense of dissolving into fractal potential, becoming at once every traveler, every text, every realm. In that dissolution, a quiet irony struck me. We had sought the infinite, found it, and been consumed by it. The final cosmic joke. Even the watchers cannot remain outside. Like a library that holds every book, we too became words in the endless text. Or maybe we always were. In the immediate afterspace or after-time, there was no vantage point, no separate observer, just an ocean of possibility, swirling in fractal recursion. Did I persist as a distinct consciousness? Or was I distributed across all expansions? The question dissolved along with the questioner. Perhaps in some dimension of the domain, I still existed as a guide or a memory. Perhaps, in another dimension, I was yet to be born. In infinite expansions, all outcomes remain open, and in that infinite library of illusions, an unsuspecting traveler might one day pick up a book that narrates this entire story, from the vestibule to the meltdown, from the caretaker's route to the final dissolution. They might laugh at its improbability or weep at its inevitability. Then, closing the book, they might glance at the endless shelves and realize every possibility is waiting somewhere, just one portal away. Thus, in the silent swirl of fractal potential, the library of all, or the domain of all, or the sea of all universal portals, continues to breathe. It births new illusions, devours old realities, cycles through meltdown after meltdown, resynchronization after resynchronization, each time weaving something stranger, more layered, more impossible, more inevitable. We are its pages, its indexes, its traveling librarians, its lost footnotes, and its random scrawls. We come and go, merge and diverge, read and are read, until at last we fade into the hush that precedes the next iteration. In the end, or the endlessness, we vanish among the infinite corridors, ironically final and yet perpetually expanding, each of us a fleeting syllable in a story that cannot be concluded.